vampirism exist in the animal kingdom. And we already know that there are some examples of vampirism in the animal kingdom. Welcome back to Killy's AI Paranormal Research. In our first episode, we looked into the origins of vampires and saw some examples about how vampires actually were officially blamed for certain instances during the vampire hysteria of the Middle Ages. But now I'd like to take a little bit of a more scientific approach. So let's take a look at our first prompt today. What examples of vampirism exist in the animal kingdom? And we already know that there are some examples of vampirism in the animal kingdom. Right away, I expect to see things from mosquitoes, vampire bats, of course. The behavior, these are the only mammals known to feed exclusively on blood. Hematophagy, they make small incisions in the skin of sleeping mammals and birds and lap up the blood with their tongues. Their saliva contains anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing. Fish such as lampreys and vampire fish, leeches, mosquitoes, of course, ticks, fleas, birds, the vampire finch. I always thought finches of like sort of delightful little birds, but apparently they can be pretty nasty according to this. That's pretty nasty, a vampire finch. I'm not going to look at finches the same way again. All right, so yeah, we already know that vampires could exist and do exist in the animal kingdom. So now I'm kind of interested, under which conditions could vampires exist scientifically or biologically in the human race? And let's see what our research unfolds. To exist as a real organism that survives solely or primarily on blood, several conditions must be in place. Number one, blood as a viable nutrient source. Blood is rich in protein and iron, but it's low in carbohydrates and fat. Okay, so for those of us who may want to shed a little bit of weight, this seems like a way to go. Vampire organism must evolve efficient systems to digest large quantities of protein, deal with the iron overload, which can be toxic, get sufficient energy despite the lack of other nutrients. Now, right here, it makes the connection with the vampire bats that they have specialized kidneys and intestines to deal with the above. Anticoagulants and anesthetic mechanisms. So we'd have to almost become the vampire bat, essentially, which is why maybe the vampire bat has been so closely connected with the myth of the vampire for so many hundreds of years. Host detection and selection. Okay, yeah, so we're getting really deep dives here into the scientific possibilities or biological possibilities of vampirism existing in humans. To avoid driving host extinctions, vampires would need low feeding frequency. Yeah, because if vampirism existed in the human race, how many of us would just become cattle to them? And then we even get into metabolism, and immortality, aversion to sunlight, hypnotism, and superpowers. A lot of stuff that we all sort of associate with the vampire myth that if biologically this were to occur, I don't think a lot of those things would accompany it necessarily. All right, as always, these prompts will be copied and pasted. I want to try one a little bit into the comments, but I want to try one a little bit more complicated. Let's see what this one says. What are the most common areas in which people claim to have seen vampires? Sort the results in descending order by those that are easily disproven, those that have not been disproven. Make a judgment as to why areas see higher rates of vampire sightings and why some are more difficult to disprove than others. All right, what I am asking ChatGPT to do is sort of remove itself from the scientific notion and see why vampire sightings were so common and where they were so common, and to sort of take the context that at some point vampires were believed to have been real. They were not a myth at one point. They were believed to be real. Go back to our first episode and we'll see that in some European countries there are proven records or documented cases of vampirism, which we now know scientifically have been disproven, but at that point they weren't. Number one is modern North America. Most cases tied to fiction, roleplay, hoaxes, vampires exist only in subcultures or staged events. Okay, so in this particular case, since I did not ask it to eliminate role-playing, it's taking into account that this is possible. Western Europe, and these Western Europe and Eastern Europe countries where the vampire hysteria did exist, easily disprove. Reports largely tied to Gothic fiction. Okay, but let's see where they're contextually difficult or difficult to fully disprove. The Yangshi hopping vampires, often reported in ghost stories, not sighting, but cultural isolation of rural regions complicates scrutiny. So these isolated areas may not have access to technology and may instill believe that the hopping vampire exists. The Balkans, Eastern Europe, home to origin stories of vampire lore, rural superstitions persist with grave exhumations documented in the 20th century. So we aren't that far from removed in the grand scheme of things of people still digging up graves to prove or disprove vampires. In the Carpathian Mountains, a region with a long tradition of vampire legends still deeply embedded in local folklore, isolation and tourism preserve its belief. This is Transylvania, and I think that obviously would lead us to believe Dracula. I mean, Dracula's castle exists there. It was Vlad Tepes was the real-life Dracula, or at least the inspiration thereof. Now, there are some sightings that are hard to disprove and some easier to disprove, but if you take the prompt that I've left for you in the comments, you're going to see a lot more of this. You can go through this on your own. All right, that's it for our second episode on vampires. We got one more coming. Until then, don't look under your bed.